Repatriation. Good day, colleagues. Thank you for joining us today. And in today's session, we'll be joined by the esteemed Dr. Philan, who has a doctorate in law from the University of South Africa. He's an educator and teaches history at a high school in South Africa, and he has been teaching since 1996. He has done research on indigenous customary legal systems and decoloniality of the systems of knowledge production. Dr. Ndlovu, you're welcome, and may you kindly introduce yourself to our listeners and tell us how your passion, or rather your desire for African history, originated.
Thank you very much, Nolwazi. Greetings to you and greetings to your listeners. As you have already indicated in the foregoing introduction, I do have a passionate interest in knowledge systems, particularly the development of African knowledge systems and their adoption as mainstream systems of knowledge. You will realize that looking at the history of Africa, we have mostly been exposed to material in the textbooks, most of which were written by European writers. So when I began teaching, I was very diligent and I read those books religiously, and they were my sources of knowledge in my teaching, until I realized somewhere along the way that there was, an absence of African knowledge systems in the school curriculum. The story, that is the history of Africa, was being told mostly from a Western perspective. So I realized that it was the story of the European in Africa, rather than the story of the African himself or herself in her own continent. So then that sent me searching for knowledge on how Africans themselves have been involved in the production of knowledge and in the production of systems that work for them, how they are agents of their own destinies rather than being recipients of some Western produced, thought. So that's how it all began.
Yeah. Oh, that's actually a very, very interesting way how your passion developed, sir. I would like to ask you, because you mentioned on how you realized there were some gaps in the knowledge. Do you feel that because decoloniality deals with opposing the formally imposed Eurocentric view, which sees the Europeans as the discoverers of Africa, do you believe that that has somehow contributed to how the world views us as Africa?
Well, you see, every story is told with a slant. I believe that as you and me are having a conversation now, when we leave this platform and we go on to tell others about what has been going on, you will tell it from your perspective, highlighting and emphasizing the things that are important on your side. And I will also do the same, which then indicates that whoever is telling the story of Africa is telling it from a certain perspective and from a certain slant. Because you find that history as a discipline that is being employed as an instrument to set agenda, to create a certain kind of thinking and to peddle and promote a particular narrative which suits the interest of the one telling the story. So it goes without saying that the way Africa's story is being told, especially by Western scholars and thought leaders, has got to do with the agenda that they seek to portray, which favors them rather than the African.
Oh, yes, very, very true. In most cases, it does favor the Eurocentric view over our view. So how would you enforce the use of multi-perspectivity in the history curriculum to help in recentering African knowledge history?
I believe you have got to begin by debunking the myth that to be is to be Western.
Yes.
We have got to get learners exposed to the fact that there is a world outside Europe and there is a reality outside the European thought. and so that they begin to endorse and to embrace the, African systems, those that existed in pre-colonial Africa and those that continue to exist up to this day. For instance, you will notice that there was a view that Africans didn't know how to teach history. They didn't have schools, as if the schooling system was a Western creation, which is not a truth in the first place. For instance, I'll give you a simple example. You know, the initiation schools that are so prevalent among the Xhosa people in the Eastern Cape. That's a kind of a school. Those people
yes, it is.
It is a school. What about the system of Ubutwasa, where those Amatwasa, those initiates, attend formal instructions for, lengths of time, where they are being instructed in the use of medicine, the development of traditional medicine and its application and so on. So all that is a school that existed in Africa, but the dominant paradigm has always been that there was no school in Africa, which is very misleading in its sense.
Oh, that is actually very true, because they've never really mentioned that. They hardly ever mention that. It's actually more undermined. Our own history is undermined. In an effort to further center African history when teaching history, how would you go about identifying and investigating additional important dates in African history? Like, how far back in history can we go in order to identify those periods which are worthy of discussion? For example, the turning points in our history, like when Nelson Mandela was released from prison, at the end of apartheid, and those turning points.
Right. I'm sure you may have heard this song that was sung by a Jamaican some time ago, which says, "Black My Story, the African Story."
Yes.
You see, you are talking about dates. And you find that dates have been brought to the front as if they are central to every discussion about history. Yes, of course, it's important to record the actual dates and so on. But if you listen, for instance, to Zulu praise names, they would track back the lineages and the achievements of each Zulu family, to the point that even though the dates are not mentioned, a child brought up in a traditional Zulu home will know his or her lineage, tracking back some centuries and centuries ago. So depending then on whose agenda one seeks to promote with this teaching of history, you find that certain dates are given prominence and other dates are undermined. You mentioned the release of Nelson Mandela from prison, which is quite a very significant point in the first place. But how come we never hear of the date when he was incarcerated? That becomes a part of this agenda setting.
Yes, yes.
I would say to you that in a way, you must track back the history of Africa to the pre-colonial time, so that we don't take the arrival of Jan van Riebeeck as if it was the invention of South Africa, or as if that's when this land became available. This land had always been inhabited before then. So the question is, who inhabited it? And what was his or her lifestyle during that time? So why should we then pick on 1652 as if it's the starting point
of Africa? Do you not are you not of the view that because of these dates that we keep getting, do you not believe that most of the time they actually are distorted, or do you believe that it is the factual evidence?
Well, the dates themselves would usually be accurate because people have kept calendars. Sometimes we've got those that compare that the dates are true, like the release of Nelson Mandela and so on.
Yes,
it was
those ones,
in 1990, it was in February and so on. But the issue that I would like to bring to your attention is the emphasis that is given to certain dates to the
Yes.
exclusion of others. Because the choice of the dates that are placed in the textbook and that are communicated to everybody has got to do with the agenda that is being peddled. It's got
By
to
the
be
colonialists.
the slant, who is telling the story and what slant is that person promoting.
Yes,
So
one that suits them. Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Ndlovu, for that. I would like to touch on the issue of, I would like to touch on the issue of patriarchy in history. How would you, as a history teacher, teach that to your learners? Like, how would you teach them to question patriarchy in our society? Because I'd like to believe this is quite a controversial topic in class.
Yes, it will all begin by your definition of patriarchy, number one. Number two, you will have to look at the origins of patriarchy in the African setting. And then thirdly, you will have to understand, seek an understanding of why it developed, whether it is a problem and how it is a problem, whether it has any positive contributions to make to society and so on. Remember, as I have already said, we have some feminist ideas and feminist philosophy that has been responsible for maybe highlighting the element of patriarchy in South Africa and in Africa in general. And interestingly, it is not even true that South Africa's society is wholly patriarchal. You will know
Yes.
about the Lobedu people, you've heard about Queen Mojaki and so on. It is an indication that there are some matrilineal societies in Africa.
Oh, yes, definitely, sir. But
and
not
I can also give examples. If you study some Malawian societies, they are matrilineal. It is women that have traditional authority and power. There are even, issues of polyandry are even well established in those societies.
Which is a very interesting thing.
But what we have been told mostly is that African society is patriarchal, which is very false in the first place. It was highlighted and exaggerated in order to paint a certain image that suited the agenda, rather the narrative that the imperialist was bent on promoting. Because having identified, or rather having insinuated that African society was patriarchal, then the European went on to suggest alternatives. And then you will find that even this feminist, what's called philosophy, is being pushed not to promote the welfare of the women as such. Of course, it does to some extent, but you find that it's also partly to do with the dismantling society, because some of those elements which are said to have been patriarchal, they had functions. Do we understand those functions? If we are doing away with them, do we have alternatives for them? So you have to expose the learners to this kind of critical thoughts so that they look at things critically.
And I'm able to look at it from a neutral point of view.
Yes.
As well. In Chief Albert Lutuli's Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech in 1960, he recognized his wife Nogukanya as a pivotal support structure in his life, especially on his journey of fighting against the apartheid system. Would you say that is his way of not completely undermining patriarchy, but also making people recognize that women do play a very crucial and pivotal role in our society, especially in changing our history?
A very interesting observation there and the question. I have already said to you that in a way, I'm not sure if you will agree with me on this one, but let me say it nevertheless.
Okay,
patriarchy in Africa, especially say in South Africa, and we are talking about Chief Albert Lutuli, who happens to have been of Zulu background, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, Harare. He was from, I believe he was born in Zimbabwe.
He was born in Zimbabwe, but Albert Luthuli was of the ANC, isn't he?
Yes, yes, of the NCS. So he had the Zulu roots
Yes,
ancestry.
right.
Yes, sir.
Now, I was going to highlight the fact
Nguni.
that women in
Yes,
the Zulu society, the Zulu history, have been
yes, sir.
central, very, very central.
Mm.
You've heard about names such as Mtania.
Yes.
Zululand is affectionately addressed by some people as Elga Mtania. And who was
Wow.
this Mtania?
What a powerful. Mm.
Mtania was a woman, the grandmother of King Shaka, the mother of King Senzangakona. She was very central in the administration of the Zulu nation. What about Shaka's aunt, Uzinkabi? Sorry, not Uzinkabi, Umkabai. Umkabai, you know Umkabai?
Mkabai, yes, Mkabai.
Umkabai,
Yes, sir.
yes. She was very, very pivotal. In fact, she ruled with, she assisted Jama, she assisted Senzanga Kona, she ruled alongside Shaga as well as Dingani. So she's one
Oh, yes.
woman who was always central in the establishment of the Zulu kingdom.
Oh, yes,
So,
very, very central figure.
yes. So
Yes.
to really suggest that there was patriarchy that excluded women is very misleading. In fact, Africa has been busy trying to fight a ghost that it never had in its own context.
Oh,
Because
yes.
patriarchy was not brought in, was not an African thing. It was brought in by the colonial system.
Yes.
Without
suppress that.
digressing, you would actually acknowledge the role played by Winnie Madikizela Mandela in strengthening Nelson Mandela himself in this
Oh,
whole
yes.
against apartheid.
And keeping his name alive while he was imprisoned.
You see that kind of thing. So the woman has always been a partner together with the man.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Oh, that's a very phenomenal way to actually explain it to our listeners. So I would also like to ask how, it's really important to know how to teach controversial history in decolonizing the history curriculum. So my question to you is, how would you teach that as a history teacher? Like any controversial topics in history, how would you teach those to your learners? For example, we learned about the passing of F.W. de Klerk just recently. And as a history teacher, that is actually quite a controversial thing because some believe that he contributed greatly in the ending of the apartheid regime, while others know that he was part of the reason of apartheid, one of the apartheid leaders. So how would you teach something as controversial as that as a history teacher in decolonizing history curriculum?
Well, I think one of the critical weaknesses of maybe South Africa's education, and particularly the history curriculum, is the refusal and the denial of, the fact that South Africa is an African country, that there are people who have come and plundered South Africa, and F.W. de Klerk being one of them. So
Yes,
we must understand him within the context of a plunderer.
yes.
Adopting strategic decisions at strategic moments and changing goalposts along the way, not for the welfare of the indigenous people as such, but for the maintenance of the status quo, as well as for the promotion of the ideas that he has always stood for. For instance, there is a narrative, and you may have to investigate this with your students, that the narrative is that at some point, apartheid was no longer profitable.
Yes, yes, sir.
South Africa was under sanctions internationally, economic sanctions and all other forms of sanctions. And even as a system of production, apartheid had lost that ability. Remember, there was always conflict, there was always friction, and that made it very impossible for people to progress in terms of making, innovations in industry, economy, and so on. So The abandonment of apartheid was not a generous act to liberate Africans and to give them freedom, but it was to just change the game plan so that it would perpetuate the dominance, but this time in a more subtle and hidden way. I'm not sure if you have been exposed to this book by this young man, Dr. Welsh Sizempofu, the one which talks about apartheid, the new apartheid, where he says apartheid was not dismantled, but it just took a different form, and it was private.
Yes.
So you may have to understand de Klerk from that perspective. It may be controversial, but you expose learners to those facts and then get them to decide based on the evidence. You are not accountable for the students' conclusions. Let everybody conclude based on the evidence, but get them
on the evidence,
the material, so that they understand different sides and then draw their own conclusions.
I've always believed that there's three sides to a story: the truth and the other two people's opinions. So I would, based on that, I would like to ask you, how do you feel about the notion of post-colonial South Africa? Do you believe that we deserve to be repatriated due to what happened to us in the past?
Are you talking about, do I believe in reparations or repatriation?
Yes. Yes.
A compensation.
Repatriation.
Sorry?
Yes, sir. Repatriation.
Well, the repatriation in this case, I'm not sure if I'm getting you, but if you are talking about reparations as in compensation for what was done.
Yes, sir. Yes,
well,
sir. Yes, sir.
To some extent, I believe that if I walked into your house and I stole your property, and then after a while we make up, I should give it back to you, number one. Number two, I should actually find a way to make good all the suffering that you've endured in my hands as a result of whatever I have done to you as a wrong. So it cannot be business as usual when people who grabbed land and properties by means of force are still holding on to them, whilst the people who were pushed out are still squashed in Alexander, living in squalid conditions, squashed in very small territory, when we have large tracts of land that are said to belong to somebody who took that land by force. In a way, this needs to be corrected, and that all correction should only come by way of addressing all those injustices of the past and getting people who stole to reimburse those from whom they stole
from. Yeah, I also agree with that very much, sir. So as a history teacher, what are your ideas for decolonizing the history curriculum, whether in South Africa or even in Africa as a whole?
Right. Number one, I believe in restoring the African to the center of the history curriculum. Find out what the African did and how the African has always been doing things in the pre-colonial times, during the colonial times, as well as the post-colonial times. Talk not about what the European has been doing to an African or what an African has been doing only in response to a European. There is a lot of other, activities of life that are taking place in the African society. Let us magnify those. Let's bring them to the front so that students are aware of what Africans have been doing as agents of their own lives and of their own destinies, rather than as the recipients of what is produced elsewhere. So the story must begin to be told, not from the perspective of the European or the foreigner or the settlers, colonial settlers, but from the perspective of the African. For instance, without taking too much of your time, the history of the liberation struggle in South Africa and the heroes are actually assigned by the perpetrator. You look at an example of Nelson Mandela, who is incarcerated and is facing a death sentence at the Rivonia trial. He was in jeopardy of being hung, by the way. People like Mahlangu. Who is this Mahlangu? Is it Solomon, who was hung?
Yes, Solomon Mahlangu.
Yes, Solomon was hung. And then later on, Mandela comes out of the prison. He is the world's darling. He is the apartheid perpetrator's hero.
Oh, yes,
yes. You must ask yourself, really, what changed? How did a prisoner become a hero?
What hero for the
people
people
inside the prison? Because the people that grabbed him as a criminal released him as a hero.
As a hero.
So you must ask yourself, what happened? Is he Africa's hero or he is apartheid's hero? Who is
hero? Yes, that's definitely something to ask the learners that would actually change their views on this mighty man that we know as the hero of apartheid.
You see that kind of thing?
Thank you. Yes. Thank you so very much, Dr. Ndlovu, for your time and for sharing your amazing views and engaging us on such a rich topic, such as the decolonization of the history curriculum. We truly appreciate your time and your ideas.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share ideas on this as well.
Thank you so much. So have a great day further, and we hope to engage with you again in future.
Thank you very much. Enjoy your day. Bye.
Goodbye.